Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Christine Schell, and I'm the Executive Assistant to the Assistant Commissioner for New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's Air Quality, Energy, and Sustainability, and I will be moderating today's event. With me behind the scenes are Kristen Brennan, our producer for today's event, and Matt Rivas. On October 15th, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection released the New Jersey's Global Warming Response Act, or GWRA 80x50 report, where 80x50 references the 80% statewide greenhouse gas reductions from 2006 levels by 2050 that is mandated by the Global Warming Response Act. This report builds on the state's previous efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the 2019 Energy Master Plan. Analyzing all sectors of New Jersey's economy, including energy production and use, transportation, waste reduction, and the state's natural resources, the report provides guidance, policies, and regulatory and legislative recommendations on how to meet the state's climate emission reduction goal. Since its release, the department, along with its sister agencies and the recently formed Office of Climate Action and the Green Economy in the Governor's Office, have worked strategically to actualize the report's findings. Today, we are fortunate to have three of the report's primary authors with us to talk about the state's efforts to meet its 2050 climate goals. Paul Orlando is the director of the Air Quality, Energy, and Sustainability's Division of Climate, Clean Energy, and Radiation Protection. Bob Kettig is the Assistant Director of AQUIS, Air Quality, Energy, and Sustainability's Bureau of Climate Change, Clean Energy, and Sustainability. And Helene Barr is the Supervisor of the Bureau of Climate Change and Clean Energy.
Next slide, please. Thank you all for joining us this morning and giving up some of your time to allow us to share with you an overview of the report and some of the activities the state and the department are engaged in to achieve the recommendations in this report. And before I introduce the components of the 80x50 report, I would like to review both historical and current climate initiatives that have led to the creation of this report. Previous climate initiatives include the formation of the Carbon Trading Program in 2005, known as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. In 2007, legislators penned the Global Warming Response Act, which mandates reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, establishing both 2020 and 2050 goals. In his first month in office, Governor Phil Murphy issued several executive orders focused on climate. He ordered New Jersey to re-enter RGGI after leaving in 2012 under former Governor Chris Christie. Governor Murphy further ordered that New Jersey should procure 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035, directed New Jersey to participate in the U.S. Climate Alliance of States to pursue common climate initiatives in the absence of federal leadership at that time. He directed state agencies to incorporate environmental justice principles in carrying out their statutory and regulatory responsibilities. And in June 2019, Governor Murphy amended the Global Warming Response Act to set new deadlines for various milestones, including the issuance of the 80x50 report, which we are here to talk to you about today. Next slide, please. The first Global Warming Response Act target required the state to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels or below by 2020. New Jersey has exceeded this goal by more than 20 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, largely due to the retirement of coal-fired electric generating units and transition to cleaner burning natural gas. The 2050 target establishes a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% from their 2006 levels by 2050. This goal is what we refer to as the 80x50 goal, which we estimate is 24.1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. As you can see, the 80x50 goal will pose a significant challenge. In 2018, our latest GHG inventory, New Jersey's emissions were near 100 million metric tons. Next slide, please. In developing a plan to achieve the emission reductions called for in the Global Warming Response Act, the state embarked in a multifaceted planning process that included multiple stakeholdering sessions that helped inform the emissions and economic modeling process of the Integrated Energy Plan, as well as components of the Energy Master Plan, which described pathways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation, residential commercial heating, and electric generating sectors. The 80 by 50 recommendations report builds on the Energy Master Plan, providing additional details on how to reduce emissions from the energy sectors, but also goes beyond the EMP to include emission summaries and various emission reduction strategies from the non-energy sectors, including industrial, waste, agriculture, and short-lived climate pollutants and sequestration. Next slide, please. The Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report is the third deliverable of the three-phased approach to address climate change mitigation in New Jersey. The report evaluates 7 emission sectors of New Jersey's economy in developing pathways to achieve the 80 by 50 goal. Each sector includes a business as usual that illustrates what happens to emissions under current policies with no additional action. Reduction pathways are described and emission reduction estimates are presented for each pathway action, and specific policy recommendations and their associated emission reductions are presented in the report. In the report, we evaluated business as usual scenarios for each sector and found that New Jersey is currently not on trajectory to achieve its 80 by 50 goal. Despite the recent actions at the state level, emissions will rebound and actually be higher in 2050 than they are today. This is mostly due to projected increases in short-lived climate pollutants as the result of increased reliance on air conditioning and heat pumps and their associated hydrofluorocarbon emissions. Next slide, please. Achieving the 80 by 50 goal will require a fundamental transformation in the way we generate and consume energy. Each one of us as individuals will need to make a commitment to do things different to reduce our carbon footprints. Ultimately, there are 3 critical strategies requiring bold action today. The first is replacing fossil fuel vehicles with electric vehicles. Second, converting space and water heating in the residential and commercial building sectors to electric heat. And third, replacing fossil fuels in the electric power generating sector with renewable energy resources. I want to stress that simultaneous development of renewable electric generation is necessary to avoid a shift in emissions to the electric generating sector. If we electrify everything but don't decarbonize electric generation, we will not achieve the 80 by 50 goal. Now I would like to introduce Bob Kettig, Assistant Director of Climate Change, Clean Energy, and Sustainability, who will go into further detail on the transportation and electrification decarbonization strategies. Bob?
I'm sorry, Bob, just a few technical difficulties. Apparently you all are not seeing a chat, and we're not really sure what is happening with that. So what we would like you to do is, if you do have questions, you can email them to us at the NJ Climate email, and we will try to work it through that system. So the email is njclimate, all one word, at dep.nj.gov, G-O-V. I will say it again, njclimate, all one word, at dep.nj.gov. And we apologize for this COVID technology blip. Now I will turn it back to Bob. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Christine, for solving that problem, getting us the path forward, and thank you, Paul. I'm going to go over some of the highlights from the transportation and electric generating sectors. Currently, New Jerseyans purchase more than 500,000 fossil fuel powered passenger vehicles annually, and existing policies and programs are not going to be sufficient by themselves to achieve the levels of market penetration of electric vehicles necessary to transform the transportation sector. Transportation emissions. Transportation accounted for 42% of greenhouse gas emissions in New Jersey in 2018. New Jersey's transportation sector dominates the state overall emissions profile. Proportionally, this is higher than most other states, but it's not because New Jersey's transportation sector is larger or more wasteful on a per capita basis. Instead, it is primarily because New Jersey's emissions from electric generation sector are substantially lower than most other states, with nuclear power meeting about 30 to 35% of New Jersey's current electric demand and a growing commitment to renewable energy in New Jersey. To achieve the 80 by 50 target, New Jersey needs to reduce emissions by 2.6 million metric tons in 2050 for the transportation sector. Next slide, please. So what's the greatest source of emissions in transportation? On-road gasoline represents the greatest source of emissions in the transportation sector, with distillate, meaning diesel, mostly from on-road diesel, also making a sizable contribution. Together, these two fuels account for about 91% of the sector's emissions. When you parse out on-road emissions, the vast majority is attributed to gasoline-powered pickups, SUVs, and passenger cars, and these are the vehicles that we drive every day. Next slide, please. So, business as usual projections. The term that we use as business as usual, or BAU, is used in emissions projections to show the impact if the current emission trends, technologies, and conditions continue throughout the entire span under consideration. BAU is often used to describe a worst-case scenario. These are only hypothetical scenarios to help highlight the alternatives being examined. If New Jersey stays on its current path, it will not even come close to achieving the level of emissions reductions necessary for the 80 by 50 goal. So how do we do this? How do we get there? Next slide, please. We evaluated 5 different pathways for emissions reductions, and in the 80 by 50 report, we go beyond the energy master plan by looking at vehicle mile traveled reductions and also emission impacts of fuel economy standards. Next slide, please. Pathway 1 is to electrify light-duty vehicles. Electrification is the single greatest force that will drive emissions reductions in the transition from fossil fuel vehicles to those powered by clean, renewable electricity. Light-duty passenger vehicles, cars, light-duty trucks, and SUVs represent the lion's share of both vehicle miles traveled and emissions produced. The 2019 Energy Master Plan calls for nearly a complete replacement of gasoline-powered vehicles by 2050, which would require 100% electric sales by 2035. This is assuming a 15-year life cycle of the vehicle. Next slide, please. Okay, so recently, the New Jersey legislature has taken steps to jumpstart the electrification in the transportation sector by passing the EV law, which specifies statutory goals for future adoption of electric vehicles. However, there is a significant gap between light-duty vehicle emission projections for the EV law and where we need to get to achieve the 80 by 50 goal. The chart on the left shows a comparison of the annual EV sales called for in the EV law, which is the light blue bar, versus the annual EV sales modeled in the Energy Master Plan and this report, which is the dark blue bar. Recent sales can be seen in the small yellow bars at the bottom. Looking at the chart on the right, if New Jersey succeeds in implementing the EV law, dark blue line, but does not achieve the deeper reductions called for in the 2019 Energy Master Plan and the 80 by 50 report, we will miss our transportation reduction goals by over 10 million metric tons. Thus, the state needs to aggressively pursue achieving nearly 100% electric vehicle new passenger car sales by 2035. Next slide, please. Pathway 2 focuses on the decarbonization of medium and heavy duty vehicles. There are many categories of vehicles on the road besides light duty cars and trucks, and this represents opportunities for further reductions. In particular, the 2019 Energy Master Plan least cost scenario calls for 75% of medium duty trucks and 50% of heavy duty trucks to be decarbonized by 2050. Decarbonizing medium and heavy-duty vehicles provides additional benefits by locally reducing criteria pollutant and carcinogens such as black carbon, which are released in greater concentrations in heavily trafficked corridors that are typically in or near environmental justice communities. We don't just say electrify medium heavy vehicles. The technology for decarbonizing this sector is still developing, and renewable diesel and biogas can still play an interim part in getting there, as well as hydrogen fuel cells. Next slide, please. Pathway 3 we looked at is increasing New Jersey's transit ridership and expansion of transit villages. Currently, the state is very focused on transportation electrification as the pathway to achieving emission reductions. But there are a number of other strategies to achieve emission reductions from the sector. The 80x50 report includes 3 other pathways for emission reductions and evaluates how these can be paired with electrification or for even deeper decarbonization. There is an opportunity to grow New Jersey transit ridership. Currently, the number of transit riders compared to car drivers is extremely low. With each added public transit passenger, the opportunity exists to reduce a reliance on light-duty cars and trucks and thereby reduce greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. In Pathway 4, we evaluated work-from-home policies, ride-sharing, and other strategies. The report also considers other strategies beyond transit and land use planning to reduce vehicle miles traveled. The COVID-19 pandemic has served as proof of concept for the long theorized ability of institutions and businesses to integrate remote work programs while maintaining productivity. People across New Jersey continue to work from home and utilize technology to connect virtually with their employers. In 2019, about 5% of the New Jersey population worked from home 3 or more days a week, but about 30% of the jobs could be performed from home. Jump forward, according to a Gallup poll that showed 33% of U.S. workforce was still working at home in October of 2020. We can't predict the future, but the new working from home economy is likely to continue long past the coronavirus. This has significant implications in reducing transportation emissions. Next slide, please. In Pathway 5, we looked at supporting regional and national efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions of light-duty fossil-powered vehicles. It goes without saying that fossil-powered vehicles will continue to be sold in significant quantities over the next several years. Thus, the state should continue to advocate for improvements in greenhouse gas emission standards for light-duty vehicles. As we build towards 100% electrification, we can still achieve reductions from more efficient vehicles. Next slide, please. So this is a combined analysis of our emission reduction pathways. So it goes to show you, like, how do all these pathways fit together? Ultimately, we found that coupling programs that reduce overall demand for transportation with electrification efforts could provide an additional net savings of 115 million metric tons over the 30-year period. That's the bottom blue line, compared to the vehicle electrification alone, which is the top blue line. Implementing transportation measures now results in immediate emission reductions while allowing time for technology to develop, cost to decrease, and adoption rates of EVs to surge. Further, if we have less vehicle miles traveled, that means less resources that have to go towards subsidizing EVs, EV infrastructure, and relying on carbon-free electricity to charge and power those EVs. Ultimately, emissions are going to have to drop to close to 5 million metric tons in the transportation sector by 2050. Next slide, please. So looking at some recent state actions, the DEP is pursuing a broad suite of regulations that address climate change, including the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, which will accelerate large-scale transitions to zero-emission medium and heavy-duty vehicles through a manufacturer zero-emission truck sales requirement and a one-time reporting of data from large fleet owners. The Omnibus Rule establishes emissions inspection procedures and standards for medium-duty vehicles in the state. The state is also investing in clean transportation with its Reggie auction proceeds. EDA's New Jersey ZIP program will be investing $15 million in electrifying medium and heavy-duty vehicles in environmental justice communities. And DEP recently announced the investment of $32 million in clean transportation projects ranging from garbage trucks to shuttle buses, which will also be focused in environmental justice communities. The BP EV rebate program, phase 1, was very successful. It dispersed about $30 million for nearly 6,000 new EVs. Phase 2 is slated to open in the summer of 2021. NESCOM, which is the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Management, coordinated the signing of an MOU between 15 states and Washington, D.C. that committed to work collaboratively to advance and accelerate the market for electric and medium and heavy duty vehicles. Next slide, please. The next, I'll talk about the electric generating chapter. So the electric generation emissions. Next slide, please. Emissions from the electric generation sector have significantly reduced in recent years, largely due to the replacement of coal generation with natural gas, implementation of energy efficiency measures, and the growth of renewable energy has also contributed to decline in emissions. However, this sector remains the third largest contributor to total state's emissions, about 19%, accounting for 18.1 million metric tons CO2 equivalent in 2018. The Energy Master Plan and the 80x50 report both assume New Jersey will achieve zero net carbon emissions from electric generation by 2050. This decarbonization of electric generation must be achieved despite a doubling of demand due to the electrification of the transportation sector and buildings. Next slide, please. So what's the greatest source of emissions in the electric generating sector? New Jersey's emissions within the electric generating sector are primarily due to the combustion of natural gas and to a lesser extent coal and waste material, including waste to energy and biomass. There's a minor contribution from other fuels such as liquid petroleum and butane. Next slide, please. So the business as usual projections for electric generation. Within this chapter of the report, we evaluated a series of electric demand scenarios, which we refer to as reference cases. The reference case A, the reference case A, which we also label as BAU, assumes electric demand remains relatively constant with minor increases to account for sales rates of electric vehicles through 2050. It also includes an assumption the Clean Energy Act energy efficiency targets are met between now and 2030. The first build out of offshore wind occurs and solar continues to grow at its current rate. It also assumes that emissions are reduced significantly in the early years due to the expansion of offshore wind, followed in later years by slower reduction as solar PV is added. However, these policies and adoption rates are not enough to drop emissions down to zero. So how will the state achieve its emissions reduction goals? Next slide, please. So the emission reduction pathways in the electric generating chapter. For that, we evaluated three pathways, and it's key that they work together to achieve the state emissions reduction goal. Pathway 1 evaluates the role of demand-based initiatives such as energy efficiency. Pathway 2 considers the growing in-state renewables such as offshore wind, solar PV, renewable biofuels. Pathway 3 evaluates the gap between demand and in-state generation, illustrating the need for importing out-of-state renewable energy. Ultimately, all three of these will need to work together to achieve the 80x50 goal. In pathway 1, reduce energy demand. So what do we mean by reduce energy demand? What we're really talking about is energy consumed by residents, businesses, and communities in New Jersey. Reducing the need for electricity lessens the amount of new generation capacity required to meet the 80x50 goal. This pathway quantifies the benefits of reductions in electricity demand associated with the Clean Energy Act electric efficiency requirement, which requires retail electricity sales to decrease by 2% annually. Next slide, please. In pathway 2, we looked at a transition from fossil fuel electric generation to renewable energy. To achieve the 80x50 goal, New Jersey must build a vast renewable energy system that will meet future demand. This calls for exponential growth in solar PV, going from about 3.5 gigawatts in 2020 to over 30 gigawatts in 2050. Also requires creation of offshore wind, growing from no offshore wind today to over 10 gigawatts by 2050. And there will also be a continued reliance on nuclear power generation and a shift away from the reliance on fossil gas. It is important to note that existing fossil gas capacity will stay in operation, gradually transitioning from serving as a major supplier of electricity in New Jersey in 2020 to serving as a backup. Resources from renewable energy by 2050. The EMP and this report assume that beginning in 2045, in order to meet Governor Murphy's mandated 100% clean energy goal by 2050, renewable biofuels will be introduced for dispatchable electric generation. Next slide, please. Pathway 3 looked at evaluating the procurement of out-of-state renewable energy. Even accounting for renewable supplies and available nuclear power, there is still a power supply deficit that must be met either through fossil power generations or additional renewable resources. This deficit is met at first with fossil generation, but in later years it is met with increasing amounts of renewable energy from out of state. Taking advantage of increasing amounts of out-of-state renewable energy will require a doubling of the transmission capacity from today's 7 gigawatts to 14 gigawatts. This will require significant planning and financial resources for that build out. Next slide, please. So looking at a combined emission reduction analysis, what we did, we evaluated a number of demand scenarios, which are referred to as reference cases in the report. Reference case D, which is the dark blue line at the top of the graph, assumes a doubling of electric demand over the next 30 years from the electrification of transportation and the building sector without a reciprocal build out of in-state renewable energy or procurement of out-of-state renewable energy. At first, emissions under the scenario are held in check as 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind are added through 2035. But thereafter, emissions rise dramatically, reach upwards of 36 million metric tons by 2050, nearly twice the rate in 2020. This illustrates why it is so important to realize the 100% clean energy goals of Governor Murphy in order to avoid shifting emissions from transportation and buildings to the electric generating sector. Next slide, please. So what are some recent state actions? Well, New Jersey has been busy in renewables. For solar, New Jersey has awarded 75 megawatts of community solar projects, and it is anticipated that an additional 150 megawatts will be awarded in the fall of 2021. A new solar successor program that will build on the success of the current solar program and provide a path for New Jersey to reach the needed solar installations by 2050 will be introduced by the end of this year. For offshore wind, New Jersey has awarded 1,100 megawatts in June 2020, and there is going to be an additional 2,400 megawatts that is anticipated to be awarded in the summer of 2021. New Jersey has also committed to develop regulatory actions consistent with Governor Murphy's mandate of the PACT rules, which is protecting against climate threats, and will be issuing rules to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, both in transportation sector and through stationary sources this year. So after covering those chapters, I would like to hand off this presentation to my colleague, Helene Barr, who will walk through the remaining sectors. And Helene is a research scientist within the Bureau of Climate Change and Clean Energy and was instrumental in putting this report together. So I'll hand it off to you now, Helene.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you to you all as well. So before I jump in here, I just wanted to remind folks that they can submit comments at njclimate@dep.nj.gov. So again, I'll be discussing the building sectors and carbon sequestration. The building sector includes all of our residential and commercial properties that are located in New Jersey, whether this be private households to multifamily buildings to retail spaces and warehouses. Decarbonizing the building sector will undoubtedly be one of the most challenging things to do to achieve the 80 by 50 mandate. New Jersey has over 3.6 million housing units and close to 600,000 commercial properties, collectively totaling about 9 billion square feet of built area. Additionally, our building inventory is fairly old, with a median age of 61 years. So that will be a lot of property that we'll need to retrofit. Next slide, please. So combined, the residential and commercial sectors account for about 26% of our statewide greenhouse gas emissions. And same as transportation, we will need to experience a radical decline in emissions in these sectors by 2050. On the left side here is the residential sector. And as you can see from the dark shaded portion of this chart, our emissions here have varied to some degree with a general upward trend. Between 2006 and 2018, the sector experienced a net increase of about 1.5 million metric tons. And this is likely attributed to the continual expansion of housing and its associated natural gas consumption. New Jersey added about 140,000 housing units between 2006 and 2018, and on average over 12,000 new natural gas service lines every year since 2004. On the right side, we have the commercial sector. And as you can see, we've experienced a slight downward trend in more recent years. Again, emissions can vary year to year due to a number of reasons, from heating and cooling degree days to investments in energy efficiency. New Jersey's commercial sector is actively taking advantage of our clean energy programs and energy efficiency opportunities, and this has likely held in check emissions growth in this sector. However, energy efficiency alone will not be sufficient to meet the 80x50 goal. Next slide, please. Pollution comes from burning fossil fuels on site, primarily for space and water heating, and also from generating electricity on site for running appliances and lighting and other heating needs within these sectors. Emissions within the residential sector are primarily due to the combustion of natural gas and to a lesser extent distillate fuel, and this holds true for the commercial sector as well. New Jersey's dependence on nearby low-cost gas resources to heat homes and run our appliances will present a challenge to decarbonizing this sector. Next slide, please. Within the 80x50 report, we have identified 2 pathways that will work together to reduce emissions from the building sector. Pathway 1 quantifies the emissions benefits of electrification of space and water heating and other appliances, which currently use oil, propane, and natural gas. Pathway 2 evaluates the role of energy efficiency in minimizing emissions. Energy efficiency improvements are firmly established as among the most cost-effective strategies available for reducing fossil fuel consumption and resulting greenhouse gas emissions. So looking at, next slide. Looking at pathway 1, this focuses on using electricity rather than fossil fuels for heating and cooking, eventually with the goal of all electric buildings powered by solar, wind, and other sources of renewable electricity. Electrification allows heating through a number of clean energy sources, whereas retaining gas fuels relies on just a few low-carbon gas fuel options, all of which are known to be expensive with very limited supply. And these renewable gas sources are best prioritized for sectors that are harder to decarbonize, like the industrial sector. So in the near term, there is a great opportunity to achieve emission reductions from fuel oil and propane electrification. Oil and propane are carbon-intensive fuels, hence prioritizing the transition away from these fuels will result in significant early reductions in the residential and commercial building emissions. Next slide, please. By 2050, we estimate that about 90% of New Jersey's residential and commercial buildings will need to have installed electric, high-efficiency alternatives for space heating and hot water. Since these types of equipment have long service lives, sales of new heating and hot water units must shift rapidly to these new technologies. And currently, the state envisions the adoption of heat pumps for these applications. Next slide, please. Looking at pathway 2, it's not just enough to do electrification of our heating and hot water. To reach zero emissions in the most cost-effective and practical way, we also need to lower our energy demand and thus our power generation through such improvements such as weatherization, high-efficiency appliances, LED light bulbs. Lower demand also allows low-cost renewable energy to be used more widely further cleaning the air and reducing our energy bills. Next slide, please. Collectively, these two pathways will potentially eliminate about 22 million metric tons of CO2 from our building sector by 2050, reducing emissions about 89%. These graphs show the relative contributions of electrifying propane, oil, and natural gas, and the additional reductions associated with energy efficiency. While moving away from natural gas applications will provide the largest emission reductions in the sector, conversion of propane and oil to electric may provide an opportunity for early adoption, and also has the co-benefit of reducing local criteria pollutant emissions. Next slide, please. The state is actively pursuing its energy efficiency goals. The Clean Energy Act required New Jersey's investor-owned gas and electric utility companies to reduce their customers' use of gas and electricity by set percentages over time. To help reach these targets, the Board of Public Utilities has approved a comprehensive suite of efficiency programs that would transition the state to some of the highest energy savings in the country. It is anticipated that these programs will launch in the summer of 2021 and will help customers to reduce their energy consumption with thermostats, LED lighting, and energy efficiency appliances. Further, the state has recently launched a Zero Energy Building Code collaboration. This effort is bringing together a diverse group of stakeholders to discuss topics related to energy code adoption, building decarbonization, and reaching state greenhouse gas reduction goals. The goal here is really to develop a roadmap that would provide options to meet the state goals for building decarbonization. And further, the state has redoubled its efforts with the local government energy audit program, and it's tackling its own state buildings to walk the talk. The DEP and the Board of Public Utilities are working together to implement benchmarking for state properties over 25,000 square feet and larger, as mandated by the Clean Energy Act. And to date, 8 DEP facilities have participated in the local government energy audit program, with more facilities planned. Next slide. Now we're going to switch our gears a bit and talk briefly about carbon sequestration. Carbon sequestration is the process by which carbon dioxide is taken up by trees, grasses, and other plants through photosynthesis and stored as carbon in biomass, which means the trunks, branches, leaves, and roots. Carbon is also stored in soils. The sink of carbon sequestration in forests and wood products and wetlands helps to offset sources of carbon to the atmosphere, such as fossil fuel emissions. If New Jersey implements the pathways proposed in the 80x50 report, its greenhouse gas emissions will still fall short of achieving its 80x50 goal. Thus, these natural sinks will be needed to offset gross emissions. It's important to note, too, that the rate of carbon sequestration varies by land type, with forests and tidal marshes sequestering larger amounts of CO2. Next slide, please. Natural carbon sinks in New Jersey, such as our forests, our woodlands, our agricultural lands, and wetlands, currently offset about 8% of our emissions. Looking forward to 2030 and 2050, we project a modest increase in the total sequestration levels. However, I would like to caution the use of this business as usual. It's important to note that this assumes that there are no significant changes in recent land use and a decline in land clearing. And this also doesn't take into account predicted sea level rise, which will undoubtedly impact our natural lands. Next slide, please. So the development of state lands continues to reduce the acreage of our valuable carbon sinks. Since 1986, New Jersey has experienced a 360,000 acre increase in land categorized as urban or developed, and experienced decreases in upland forests, cropland, grasslands, and wetlands. Between 2012 and 2015, New Jersey developed almost 10,000 acres of forests, 9,000 acres of wetland, and over 2,000 acres of cropland. And currently, a total of about 34% of our land is now classified as urban or developed. Next slide, please. So within the report, we identify 5 preliminary pathways for maintaining and increasing carbon sequestration in the state. I would like to note that these estimates were developed by the United States Climate Alliance on behalf of New Jersey, and they utilized a variety of methods to assess carbon gain by land type. I would like to stress that these analyses were very preliminary and there is more work currently underway. Next slide. So this pathway considers reforesting a variety of land types, including pasture and cropland and wetlands. Reforestation refers to the process of replanting an area with trees, and it represents the biggest opportunity for carbon gain in the state. Reforestation can sequester significant amounts of carbon in both soil and woody biomass, and this pathway, we estimate, could provide an additional 2 million metric tons of carbon sequestered. Many studies have also shown that reforestation is a really cost-effective natural climate solution. Next slide. As I noted earlier, New Jersey continues to lose natural land to development, and this does put our carbon sinks at risk. New Jersey is the nation's most developed state, and it continues to get more developed every year. That being said, New Jersey does have some very strong land preservation policies in place, and over the last 5 decades have resulted in the public ownership of development rights for more than a third of New Jersey's land area, protecting over 1.5 million acres. So this pathway evaluates additional carbon that could be stored if we eliminated forest loss to other land uses and grassland conversion to cropland. We found that we could gain about 0.2 million metric tons through implementing this pathway. Next slide. Our third pathway considers the role of blue carbon. Blue carbon refers to organic carbon that is captured and stored by the oceans and coastal ecosystems, including seagrass meadows, tidal marshes, and mangrove forests. These ecosystems store carbon at a rapid rate and can sequester carbon in the soil for thousands of years. Unfortunately, New Jersey's tidal marshes are at risk from sea level rise, and modeling suggests that the state tidal salt marsh could decline anywhere between 5 and 9% by 2050. Rising seas, however, can create new salt marshes where marsh migration pathways are protected and left open. We currently have an estimated 191,000 acres of blue carbon resources. However, we don't have detailed projections on how much additional carbon could be generated through restoration, protection, and enhancement of those lands, and the state is exploring how to do that. Next slide, please. The fourth pathway looks at the management of agricultural lands. New Jersey has about 411,000 acres of harvested cropland that could benefit from better land management practices. So this pathway evaluates the carbon gain potential from using cover crops and cropland nutrient management. Cover cropping refers to crops grown primarily for the benefit of soil rather than producing harvestable crops. They are typically grown in the off-season before the field is needed for growing the cash crop. Cover cropping can build soil carbon storage over many years. Within this pathway, we also evaluated the more efficient use of nitrogen fertilizer and avoided upstream emissions from fertilizer manufacturing. Fertilizer use is associated with the release of nitrous oxide, a potent greenhouse gas. Nitrogen-based fertilizer, which stimulates microbes in the soil, then converts nitrogen to nitrous oxide at a faster rate than normal. With this pathway, we estimate that we could have a carbon gain of about 0.2 million metric tons. Next slide, please. And last but not least is pathway 5, proactive forest management. New Jersey's carbon sinks are at an increased risk due to wildfire, invasive species, pest, disease, and inundation as a result of climate change. And proactive land management can improve tree growth and work to support and protect our mature forests that are vast carbon resources. New Jersey's pineland forests are particularly vulnerable to becoming net emitters due to their increased density, which leaves them more vulnerable to pest species such as the southern pine beetle. This pathway considers the role of forest management in protecting and enhancing New Jersey's existing forests. However, we have not fully quantified the carbon sequestration benefits from this pathway, and we are going to be working towards that effort, and that's currently underway. Next slide, please. So preliminary evaluations indicate that these pathways could provide somewhere between 2 to 3 million metric tons of additional carbon stored per year, with reforestation presenting the biggest opportunity for carbon gain in the state. Next slide, please. So I am happy to announce that the DEP is dedicated to furthering carbon sequestration in the state. Building off the work done in this 80 by 50 report, the department intends to develop a natural working land strategy for the state. The strategy will look at the state's natural lands from forests and wetlands, grasslands, and agricultural lands with the goal to identify and create opportunities and outlines specific projects and activities for New Jersey's natural working lands that will sequester carbon, build ecosystem and community resilience, provide ecosystem benefits, and enhance our economy. Within this effort, they're helping to develop as well statewide carbon sequestration targets that are consistent with the 80x50 report. Next slide. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Next slide. In conclusion, achieving the state's 80x50 greenhouse gas reduction goal will require action from every single sector of New Jersey's economy. It's really not enough to just decarbonize our electric grid or transition to electric vehicles. We need to do both and more at the same time. And if these actions are not taken, our 2050 greenhouse gas emissions will be higher than they are today at an estimated 106 million metric tons in 2050. Next slide. So how can you help? Some easy things that you can consider is maybe making your next car purchase an electric vehicle. Consider purchasing electric appliances when it's time to upgrade, whether that be heat pumps to electric stoves, to electric or solar thermal water heaters. Consider other electric appliances like lawn equipment. Additionally, consider ways that you can reduce your energy demand at home. The state has a great home energy audit program through the Board of Public Utilities that you can take advantage of. And, insulating, purchasing a programmable thermostat, and strategizing your remodeling to improve efficiency can all help reduce your fossil fuel use. Finally, consider taking advantage of renewable energy and some of the incentive programs out there. As already discussed, there will be a new solar successor program out there for homeowners across the state. Next slide. With that, I would like to thank you, and this is the link where you can find the full report. Next slide, and I'm going to hand it back to Christine to moderate the Q&A now.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. That was a lot of information for you to process. Again, I want to give you that email and apologize profusely for the chat snafu. But the email again is njclimate, all one word, at dep.nj.gov. And feel free to email us there even afterwards if you have questions about some of the information that you heard. We do have some questions, so I'm going to go through a chat with our panelists. And I am going to start with Helene Barr. The question is, how would the shift in natural gas to wood products from heating homes help reduce emissions?
Is that one for me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. Well, it would get you off fossil fuels, but there are some other considerations when you switch to wood products in terms of producing particulate matter. So that would be sort of a difficulty there. I don't know, Bob, if you want to chime in on this at all. I know you've worked more in this area than I have.
Yeah, the transition to burning any solid fuel for supplemental heat is even if that solid fuel is produced from sustainable sources, is going to provide a continual challenge of the local loading for criteria pollutants, particularly particulate. So what the EMP pointed to is developing a transition not towards supplemental heat from solid fuel, but from relying on renewable energy for electricity to provide an opportunity for a transition from fossil fuels such as natural gas pipeline sources in residence to using heat pumps. So the path to 2050 to achieve the reduction and also take into consideration criteria pollutant concerns doesn't lead us to solid fuel as a supplement. It leads us to either ground source or air source heat pumps becoming more economic from an economy of scale and starting to be installed at a greater rate in new construction.
Great, thank you, Bob. Moving on to Paul Orlando. We have a question. Given its current importance in accounting for large chunks of New Jersey's emission-free energy, shouldn't growing our nuclear energy supply be part of our decarbonization efforts?
Thank you, Christine, and thank you for that question. Yes, New Jersey is fortunate to have the benefits of zero carbon energy production in such mass quantities that the nuclear industry provides through the 3 nuclear power plants in South Jersey. Historically, or recent history shows that building new nuclear has been difficult, with only 2 new plants, I believe, in the state of Georgia under construction at this time. But we fully support the maintaining of nuclear power in general, as it helps to attain the goals that we, and helps give us the benefit of the carbon-free energy that we do enjoy today. And as new technologies in like small modular reactor nuclear energy is looked at nationally, that could be part of the picture of the solution of electric growth in the future.
Thank you, Paul. Helene, how does the 80x50 report use and coordinate with DEP's draft forest action plan?
Sure thing. To give a little bit of background for folks, the draft forest action plan, I think, was released or maybe the final one was released at the end of this year, and it is like a 10-year strategic plan that sort of shows how the state's going to manage its forest resources. And these efforts were closely coordinated, and I do believe it was perhaps the first time that there was like a climate change section in the state's forest action plan, and it all aligns really closely. And I think that the natural working land strategy will further help refine New Jersey's approach in that area.
Great, thank you, Helene. Sorry, just like flipping through the questions, trying to bounce so I don't keep picking on the same person. Bob, if I'm renting an apartment, how can I get access to solar?
Good question. And the community solar program is an excellent opportunity to do that. What the community solar program essentially allows is a virtual net metering relationship, and what that really means is like, everybody, you see solar on people's roofs, and so what's happening is they're using the electricity that's produced by the solar. So they're not billed for that. They're producing it right on their roof, and then the excess is supplied to the grid, and then that helps decarbonize the grid that we all get our electricity from. But often ratepayers that rent a house, or they live in an apartment building, or maybe they live in an older house where the roof structure is not really suitable. They're often not able to take advantage of the emerging renewable energy opportunities in New Jersey. So what community solar does, it allows a solar developer builds a solar installation, and that supplies electricity to the grid. But that solar developer, by getting approval for the community solar program, is then signing up ratepayers where they are getting a discount on their electricity. So even though the solar isn't physically connected to your house, in a community solar program, it operates in a virtual net metering. Like, you're getting the benefit of the reduced cost of the renewable energy, but it's not installed on your house. So I would encourage really all ratepayers to go ahead and take a look and see where community solar, find out about it from the BPU website, and see if there's opportunities to sign up for that and leverage the opportunity to take a part in the growing renewable energy economy in New Jersey.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. So Paul, Orlando, I'm going to shoot this one to you. How are the state agencies working together to support the governor's climate goals?
Thank you, Christine. Another great question. We are working hand in hand with our sister agencies, the Economic Development Authority, the Board of Public Utilities, and others on many issues, one of them being the Zero Emissions Building Collaborative, which has stakeholdered and is working towards achieving the decarbonization of the building sector. All of the coordination of RGGI funding has happened through the EDA, BPU, and DEP in a strategic funding plan, and many other examples like that are going on every day with all of the agencies to help achieve the governor's goals.
Thank you, Paul. So with that, we're going to wrap up from today. The recording of this presentation will be posted on the DEP's climate website. Give us a few days for that. And again, that climate email is a resource for you if you have questions for us about climate change mitigation or adaptation in the state of New Jersey. Both sides of DEP's house do have access to that email. So thank you again for joining us this morning, and have a lovely rest of your day.